Alrighty, it's great to see everyone. Good Wednesday and good morning. Of course, our thoughts, tefillot, our learning is with one eye here and one eye in Israel. We hope our learning today should be further merit for peace and quiet to return to the region and end of this nightmare. We have exciting prospect ahead of us. We start a new book. It was particularly meaningful to be able to finish the book of Vayikra in Shul. After last year, we weren't able to, but we start a new book, new process, and of course, a new Haftarah. The Haftarah this week is from the prophet Hoshea, the second chapter. And we're going to talk a little about Hoshea in general. The first part of Hoshea, or who is Hoshea? Let's start there. Who is Hoshea?
He's the first in the Treyasar.
He's the first in the collection of Treyasar, you're right. So that doesn't necessarily tell us much about him, right? But it's not necessarily the case that Treyasar is arranged chronologically, that the 12 minor prophets are arranged chronologically. The Gemara tells us that he is the first of a group of prophets that sort of function contemporaneously. That is Hoshea, a group of four: Hoshea, Yeshayahu, Amos, and Micha. That they sort of all functioning somewhat contemporaneously. Hoshea is addressing the northern kingdom, and it's from the north. Amos is also, but he's a southerner. And Hoshea really heralds a change, a switch from sort of what we've been describing, a break between the early prophets and the later prophets, right? The early prophets, we've been talking about how it's much more narrative, how the prophecies are sort of interjected into the narrative, but it's really story. Think of the story we read of David, of Shmuel, of Joshua, right? Those are much more story-based, they're much more narrative. But what I want to pick up on a little bit also is that there's a big difference here between the type of reality that the Jews are living in, as opposed to, just to finish the analogy, so the early prophets are these story-based, like David, Joshua, we've been reading about, and the later prophets are much more prophetic messages that are given. We're not really given a lot of historical, sociological facts. It's not narrative. It's essentially like messages to the Jewish people, right? We saw that in Amos, we saw that in Jeremiah, and Yirmiyahu, Yeshayahu. But there's a difference also in the context or the content of the prophets that we're talking about, in terms of the prophecies. Think about the story, the ebb and flow of the story of Joshua or the Judges, or even King David that we've been reading, right? What happens? The Jewish people are living in their land. They're not the most pious. They're not the worst, not the best, not the worst. And they sort of slip a little bit and they start maybe serving idols, doing something incorrect. And so we read of an oppressive power that sort of comes from the region and oppresses them. And then the Jews cry out, they do some type of tshuva, whether that's on their own or sparked by a leader like a prophet or a shofet, a judge. Think about Devorah or any of those people, right? And what happens? The Jewish people band back together. They repel the foreign influence, the local entity that has sort of subjugated them. They expel them and they get their freedom and they go back to serving God, and they do as the story and Kings say over and over again, Is Hoshea now they do what's right, they do what's proper, they follow whatever until they dip again, and then they begin to backslide, and this cycle sort of repeats itself. Do we ever hear in the time of David and the time of the Judges and the time of Joshua that the Jewish people are going to be exiled, that their kingdom is going to be wiped out, that their settlement is going to be destroyed? I know these are very hard words to say today. I recognize that, and as preparing this Torah, I've sort of been thinking in that frame. I'll just put that disclaimer out here now. Right? We don't think about that, right? That's not the frame of the early prophets. The later prophets, and particularly Yeshayahu, particularly Hoshea, we learned today, introduces a paradigm shift. And it's not just a paradigm shift, it's so much more than that. A reality shift of what's at stake here, right? It's not about this sort of ebb and flow, this up and down of service of God, but almost a total severance of what could happen if the people continue to act inappropriately, act unfaithfully, continue to carry out the moral failings that they have, right? Hoshea begins similar to what we read about in Yirmiyahu and in Yeshayahu, about a warning of a total destruction, that the Jewish people will be exiled, the kingdom of Israel will be wiped off the face of the earth. Lee, is that a question you have? All right. For us, we sort of, jump between the different Haftarahs. So that's familiar to us, that language, as scary as it is. But for the Jews, this is a new line of conversation that was never in their mindset. Rabbi Moshe Lichtenstein, who I often look at before we prepare this class, he gives an analogy in one of his writings. Imagine today, right, you have a religious Zionist leader who, often will say things like, we need to do better, we need to this, we need to that, and it always ends with, so that we can have a better state, so that we can have a more just state, a state of greater holiness. But it rarely ends, it never ends with, and if you don't, Israel's going to fall. We're going to be wiped off the face of the earth, right? That type of language we don't have. Again, I say that recognizing, the backdrop of today and how haunting those words are. But that's really the mindset that Hosea brings to the people the first time, right? That's the message Jeremiah gives. And for now, if we look at it that way, it almost gives you a glimpse to why the people were so reticent to accept that line of thinking. Why Jeremiah gets thrown in a pit, why Yeshayahu gets prosecuted, why Hoshea is outcast, right? It's just not part of the language. It's not where the mindset is. It's not what the people are thinking. Yeah, things can be better, but are they really that bad that that's what we would merit? And so that's sort of the stage that Hosea brings. That's the change here. That's the part of the transition between the early prophets and the later prophets that Hosea is the beginning of. So that's a little background of Hosea. Very background. Let's talk about this. This Haftarah begins in the second chapter. Let's talk about the first chapter, right? I have a friend, this is his bar mitzvah parsha. So, you rarely talk at your bar mitzvah about your Haftarah. This is a Haftarah that you never talk about at your bar mitzvah parsha, right? The story of Hoshea, these first two chapters, is a long out story, metaphor, essentially where God instructs the prophet to marry a prostitute, and then to have children with her, to name them Lo Ami, to name them You Are Not My Nation, to name them You Are Not Welcome, You Are Not Mercy, You will not be mercy, you will not have mercy on you, Lo Ruchama, you won't have mercy on you. If you have a Navi, if you have a Tanakh and not just the art scroll in front of you, if you have the art scroll, Stone Chumash, on page 1180, if you have a Navi, you just turn back to the previous chapter, right? And God's in the second verse, God tells him, go basically marry a wife of a prostitute, a wife that is that won't be faithful for you, and have a child, and you'll have numerous children. Verse number 6, call the child, call the daughter Lo Ruchama, that you are not, that you will not have Rachmanu, Rachem. You will no longer have any pardon or be accepted before God. Have another child, and call them, verse number 9, which is the intro to our verse, into our Haftarah. Vayomer. So they have another a baby. And what do they say? A boy this time. Vayomer, and call to this, chapter 1, verse 9. Kira Shemo Lo Ami. Call them Lo Ami. Right? If you're looking for the top 10 worst names to give your son, Lo Ami is number 1. Right? You are not my nation. You are, right? Why? Ki atem lo ami, for you are not my nation. Va'anochi lo eya lachem, and I will not be your God. Right? We are undoing the covenant of Sinai. Right? God says to the Jewish people, I will be for you. You'll be for me a nation, and I'll be for you Elokim. Ve'elahem le'elohim. Right? God's undoing that. We're done. You are not my nation anymore. And that's where That's where Hosea begins this conversation, right? It's a jarring conversation, this very different type of rhetoric. None of that happened during the prophets, right? Is the message clear here? Awesome. So that's really Hosea. That's Hosea where he comes in. So what happens? This is where the prophecy begins. And the number of the Jewish people will be like the sand, asher lo yimad, that won't ever be counted and won't be measured. B'makom asher yomar alehem lo amiatem yomru lahem b'nei el chai. This is already the change, right? There's consolation here. Again, talked about this last week. The frame of the Haftarah is not necessarily the frame that the prophet is giving us, right? We just talked about this disastrous consequence that will befall the Jewish people. And the end of that prophecy is when things will go back to be better, right? That there's some consolation. After this total severing of the relationship with the Jewish people, it won't be totally severed, but there'll be some redemption at the end. There's a smack of a little speck of consolation. That's all we read in the Haftarah. Haftarah is all about consolation, right? You'll be in a place and you'll say, Lo Ami. They'll say to you that you're not God's nation. And you tell them, Hoshea, you tell them, no, you are B'nai El Chai. You are the children of a living God, of a relationship. You are still connected to God, right? If you just read it in the Haftarah, right? What do the photographers do? They go like this, they frame the shot, right? If you frame the shot from the Haftarah, this is like a beautiful verse, right? It's unbelievable. You'll be downtrodden. You'll be sent away. People will point to you and say you're no longer connected to God. And the prophet says, no, God tells to you, no, you are children of a living God who has a relationship with you, right? That's the freeze frame of the Haftarah. But if we read it in the context of the prophet, it's much more damning. Who's telling you you have no relationship with God? Not some crusader in the Middle Ages, not some Nazi in Nazi Germany. God is telling you that you have, violated the treaty, and therefore you have treated, the relationship with God like a prostitute. You have been unfaithful to God, right? And that's really, Haftarah sort of comes in on those heels, but Haftarah is much more of consolation, like so many other Haftarot. So continuing on, and we're just it's a long Haftarah. We're gonna highlight a couple of parts. So what's gonna happen? Verse number 2. We'll gather B'nai Yisrael, B'nai Yehuda, B'nai Yisrael Yachdav. We'll gather the Jewish people, the people of Yehuda and Israel, the north and south together. V'samu lahem rosh echad. You'll have one head. You'll be reunited, and you'll be all connected in the land. Imru lachechem Ami. Call your brother Ami, my nation, meaning don't call him Lo Ami anymore, but call him Ami, and call your sister Ruchama, not Lo Ruchama, not you won't have any mercy, but Ruchama, you will have mercy. You will be an object of mercy, as the Art Scroll translates, which is probably very appropriate, right? You will be an object that will be given God's mercy, as opposed to Lo Ruchama, you'll be an object that will not have been given God's mercy. Rivu, So this is sort of what goes on. The story continues. Essentially, Hoshea has this relationship with this prostitute, and over the course of the first chapter and the second chapter, right? Hoshea learns and basically says to God, even though she hasn't been faithful for me, I still have this relationship. We still have this existential bond, and so God uses this relationship as a metaphor not only of the terrible atrocities that the Jewish people have committed against God, but the recognition that even at that level, God is connected to the people, that God cares about the people. And you read on in verse 4, verse 5. I'm just going to read it quickly in English because I want to highlight like a very interesting point about this. Bear grievance against your mother, bear grievance, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband. Let her remove her harlotry from before her face, and her adulteries from between her breasts. Right? So what are we talking about over here? That, what's the challenge? The challenge is not a passing ebb and flow of the people that, they sort of aren't well behaved at the moment. But as we talked about, part of the metaphor, part of the imagery here is that this is deeply ingrained in what is going on in the people. This isn't a passing fad, but this is something that is a behavior that isn't a bug, but a feature of the people. And so sort of responding, we're using the metaphor here as essentially being the mother's milk, right? This is the way you were trained. This is how you were brought up. So your lack of faithfulness is much more damning. It's not like a time of crisis, but something that is much more a challenge. And we'll sort of put on hold, but to begin to think about what is this connecting to our Haftarah, to our Parsha, right? We're beginning the book of Bamidbar. And the argument I'd like to make is nuanced, is that there are really two hooks to our Parsha. One is directly to our Parsha, which is at the very beginning where we're talking about the count, which we'll come back to today. And the other is a broad sweep, not just of the book of Bamidbar, but not just the Parsha of Bamidbar, but of the whole book. The whole book is sort of this slow decline of the people. And we'll see in a second that the anecdote is Bamidbar in the desert. And what's the primary sin of Bamidbar? Is the sin of the spies, which isn't, if you think about the two major sins of the Jews in the desert, right? There are two. One is the golden calf, and the second is the spies. But there are other sins, but we'll wipe them away today. Those are the two major communal, massive failings of the people, right? What if you think about fundamentally about the golden calf, as terrible as it is, it's an offense against God, an attempt to replicate a spiritual experience in a young fledgling people. We could sort of excuse that as immaturity, but not a feature of the people. The people want to be connected to God. They just did that in an illicit way, right? If we think about Shlach, the story of Shlach is far more damning because it is a perhaps underlines, or at least what we'll argue and what the Haftarah I think is sort of bringing into conversation is this notion that people are too comfortable. They don't want to fight for the land. They don't want, there's this sort of pull of the challenges of materialism, of not seeing the special, unique spiritual qualities of the land of Israel, of Moshe, right, which is all the story of all the challenges that befall Bamidbar, and not wanting to do that. And so the people here, that's a really ingrown issue that the people have here, and they have to shake that out of them. And part of what the prophet here is saying is the reason why the response is so dramatic. We're talking about exile, severing the relationship with God, wiping the people off the face of the land. That's because this sin is so great and so embedded in them. And that's sort of symbolized here by the wife and the mother, who is the bearing these children, but has this fatal flaw of not being faithful to her husband. She's a prostitute, and not being faithful, obviously, between God and the Jewish people in that sense. So what happens? So what do you do? Verse number 5, lest I strip her bare and stand her up as on the day she was born. Again, this notion that the sin all is ingrained from her mother's milk, right? That this is sort of what she was raised in, and therefore she needs to be reprogrammed. That the desert is this place where of new beginnings, of new opportunity, where there's sort of like a rebirth that's going to be here. We haven't talked about the desert. That's the next part. And I shall set her like a wilderness and place her on a parched land, and I will kill her with thirst. Meaning, you'll obviously not kill her because he wants to still be in a relationship with her. Meaning, he'll remake her with thirst. For I shall not have mercy on her children, for they are children of harlotry. For their mother had been promiscuous; she conceived them, she who conceived them has shamed herself. For she said, I'll go after my lovers, the people who gave me bread and water and wool and flax, oil and my drink. Meaning, she's being pulled by all the temptations of the world to be in relationship with God. And then really the rest of this story here is this push and pull between, on the one hand, wanting to cut her off because she's this unfaithful wife, but Hoshea and really the God speaking about this internal relationship that they have, this existential relationship that they have throughout. And the role of trying to resurrect and bring back that relationship. Of course, it ends with the very popular phrase in verse 21 and 22 that I shall be betrothed, that I will, it says marry, it doesn't mean marry, it means betrothed. I will renew the relationship. I will consecrate the relationship, not just marry. I will consecrate the relationship again. With justice and righteousness, kindness and mercy. It's interesting the lines here, right? Part of a relationship between us and God and between our spouses is not just about mercy and kindness, but about justice and righteousness between one another, and those requirements towards one another, mutual respect, mutual accountability, not just, loving kindness is important. I'm not minimizing that in a marriage, but a foundational part of mutual respect, of mutual accountability, in some ways precedes that. And then emunah and knowing God. Knowing God is a very interesting line to end with. I actually wrote like a 15-page paper in college on this. So I could spend from today till Shavuos talking about what is this knowledge of God? What does that mean? Is that a knowledge of God? Is that a knowledge of the divine? Is that a knowledge of a relationship? Is that a knowledge of morality? And I can bring you different textual proofs from across Tanakh that sort of back up all of those different things. And what's Hoshea really meaning here? I'm not going to get into that right now. But it's this beautiful line again at the end, which is framed in this very difficult Haftarah. It's almost like that Kodak moment where we're snipping from the Haftarah, from the laden or the general text, words that are challenging but also have consolation, as opposed to are much more dire. Let's talk a little bit deeper about some of these pieces, about the crisis and consolation, that balance. Some of the, this idea of the wilderness is really interesting. If you look at verse 16 and 17 in our Torah, that he'll take her to the wilderness. I will therefore, behold, I will lure her and bring her into the wilderness and speak to her tenderly. And I will give her vineyards from there, from the valley of Ahor, or depending what that is, for a gate of hope. And she shall respond there as in the days of her youth and in the day when she came up from the land of Egypt. Meaning there's this recitation of the relationship. And there's a significance here of the place of wilderness as a place of redemption, a place of repentance, but also connected here is sort of stripping away what the sin is. The sin is being, called to all of the different ta'avot, challenges of the world, temptations of the world. So here the Haftarah sort of says, you can strip away that by going back to the foundation of what you need, as opposed to all the exuberance and luxury you have in the world. And that's sort of what the wilderness represents. And that's really where the end comes up for consolation, meaning if their marriage is based on couple being able to provide pleasure to one another, or riches to one another, or monetary benefit or comfort. So when you go to a desert, none of that is possible. So then both sides sort of part ways. But if a marriage, in the case of true love, is existential and internal connection, so even in a place of wilderness, even if a spouse is in prison, right, that relationship remains undisturbed between the two people. And that's sort of the promise that Torah ends with, that God will return to Israel when Israel returns to God and have a permanent bond that can never be severed, and not for just some passing gain, right? That's sort of where Torah here is highlighting. Again, the background for this, which we don't have lots of time to get into, is the northern kingdom is immensely wealthy right now. the northern kingdom, and Amos talks a lot about this, is immensely wealthy. They have their summer homes and their winter homes, and they're fat and they're eating lovely and they're living high life. And there's all the challenges that are associated with affluence. And they've sort of turned their back on God. And this imagery of the desert, which of course connects to our Parsha Bamidbar, this imagery of the desert sort of catches our idea of stripping away all of that affluence, all of that wealth, all of that luxury, all of that opulence and consumption, and therefore what draws them to the idols, to the easy, sort of relationship with an idol, transactional relationship with an idol, is sort of be removed. That's sort of the Haftarah's message to us. How does that tie in? How does that tie into our parsha? Is the next part. But before I want to stop, any questions? Any questions or comments? Please, you're muted.
Yeah, Rabbi, I have a question.
All right, then we'll go to Steve. Yeah.
Okay, in verse 18, it said, "It shall be on that day, the words of Hashem, you will call me my husband, and you will no longer call me my master." That's Yud Chet. Do you have, why you will not call me my master?
Meaning, if we're talking about the relationship between the wife and Hoshea, and he is her, a Baal in Hebrew is also a master, right? But a Baal also is also a husband. A Baal is also a master, right? Baali is my husband also. Hoshea is playing on the words here. Their relationship until now, as much as he was married to her, she was a prostitute. She was unfaithful to him. He was just another John, What's happening here in the desert, and she'll come back like she did in her youth, is that they're rekindling that relationship, and the relationship is now changing. And they're using a play on words here, and that both of them mean husband, but one refers to a relationship of mutual respect, of connection, ishi, right? My spouse, right? And as opposed to Baal, which doesn't in the typical Hebrew carry the master dominance relationship, but behind it, the etymology does, right? She was a prostitute. He was he paid her, whether that was in the marriage or whatever, right? It was transactional, right? And now they're switching that model, right? That's exactly this idea. And that flows into I'll remove all the old names of the Baalim, and you won't mention that anymore, and you'll parade the Karati Lam Brit by Yomahu, and the new covenant will be ushered in, and you'll have this betrothal, this new sanctification of that relationship, which is part and parcel of this transition from a Baal to an Ishi.
Okay, so more equal then. More
equal, yeah. Although really Baal and it means that in modern Hebrew, it's lost that connotation. Perhaps in the context here, it's highlighting that renewed mutual relationship, relational engagement, as opposed to transactional interaction.
Thank you.
Steers.
Thank you. In 22, at the end of 22, V'yada'at et Hashem. So in Sepharia, it's translated as then you shall be devoted to the Lord, quote unquote. So is that a completely different way of looking at that, or?
So Rashi describes over here, quoting the Chelta. No, it's the wrong verse, excuse me. Let's see. I mean, the question is, what does that mean to know God, right? So either you can, knowing God can be like in the context of a biblical type of knowledge, intimacy, right? And that would fit nicely with this sort of reinvigorating of the relationship, of an intimate relationship that is based on this sort of Kedusha that we're talking about as opposed to more transactional. It could be, a knowledge of God. It could be just a devotion, right? What role does the et play over here, right? Et is like the definite article identifier, whatever the technical term is for the word et, right? What role does et play in this? Et is a sign of definite direct object, right? And we always learn in school, right? Et is has no translation. It's not true. And when you become a native Hebrew speaker, you start using et in a sentence because it makes sense structurally. It is a sign of the definite article, the definite object in the sentence. So what does that mean? You'll know God, right? Is it you'll know God, like you'll be devoted to God, you'll know God, you'll have an intimacy with God, v'yada Avraham et ishto, right? Or v'yada, I think Adam et Chava, right? That sort of relationship, but also et can mean with, right? Or can mean, be connected. It's a preposition at times. So, there are a lot of ways of reading this. I can take up my paper and send it to you if you want. I wrote it for Professor Kohler, I think in like my sophomore year. And just to go back to Renana's question, look at the commentaries for a second. What verse was this you said? Oh, here it is. Verse 18. So let's see. What does Rashi say? So Rashi says exactly that. Za'avduni, you'll serve God. Again, this is the metaphor of the relationship with God. Mi'ahava, from love. Below mi yira, and not from fear.
Fear, yeah.
She lashon ishut, chivut v'chivat na'arim. Ishi is a language of a relationship that is based on love, affection, intimacy. Ba'ali, or ba'ali, lashon is a language of adnut, of like mastership, of morah, of fear.
That's what Rashi is saying?
Yeah, this is what Rashi says. What's interesting, he quotes a midrash, which I'm taking no stance on. Kikala bebeit chama lo kikala bebeit aviha. The relationship will be like a kala in her in-laws' house as opposed in her father's house, right? I'm not sure what that means exactly, but that's sort of what the relationship sort of works as. All right, so let's talk about how this connects to our Haftarah, right? That's where I sort of want to end with. So there are really two sorts of connections that we can highlight. One is a surface, and one's a thematic. So let's start with the thematic, and then we'll get to the surface. What is the story of Bamidbar about? Bamidbar is the story of the ideal, right? The book of Bamidbar is, they're setting up this camp, the Mishkan's in the middle, everything is going well, everyone's still part of the camp, right? We haven't really sent people out of the camp yet. Everyone gets flags, they get counted, they get put in their place. This is the ideal Jewish society. And we are marching, well, the whole book of Bamidbar is about the march to the land of Israel, which unfortunately gets derailed by challenge after challenge after challenge, and then essentially gets postponed for a generation because of the spies. And that's really the story of Bamidbar. Story of Bamidbar, the book of Bamidbar, can also be called Things Fall Apart, right? Things fall apart, right? We start with this pinnacle. We have the Mishkan. We've fixed the whole issue of the golden calf. We learned about how to be Mamlechet Kohanim, how to be a priestly, righteous nation. We are setting up the divine march to the land of Israel. There's a verse we'll read next week's Parsha. Nosim anachnu, Moshe says, we are traveling to the land of Israel. We are in the airport. We're on our way. We are going, right? And then all of a sudden, everything falls apart, right? That is the story of Bamidbar. And even the challenges that we have in Naso, we learn about some of the challenges of the flaws in society. Gezel Ager, what do you do when you steal from a convert, meaning people are taking advantage of the most oppressed in society? What do you do with a sotah? What do you do with a nazir, someone who's striving for different types of things? And we deal with those. Those are fine. Those are just potholes along the way. We're still traveling. But then we get to shlach. And we get a type of response that is severance, right? A total reminder of the fact that they have, stepped over a huge line. For the first time in Jewish history, this generation is no longer redeemable, right? Even after appeasement, even after tshuva, right? Exile and destruction come into the world for the people and for the future, forever and ever, right? That is the story of Shlach, right? And then for 40 years later. And what happens after Shlach? What happens after Shlach? We get all these mitzvot, challah, the mitzvah of challah, of taking from our dough. We get the mitzvah of nisachim, of bringing the libations on the altar. All of those are prefaced when you come to the land of Israel, right? There's a certain message. The people are despondent. They are, each of them, we'll get to that when we get to Naso, but each of those mitzvot are really mitzvot of optimism, of hope, of faith for the future, because I'm giving you a command when you get to the land of Israel. From the land of Israel, you will still get there. It will take 40 years. This generation is not going to be part of it, but the Jewish story is only paused, it's not destroyed. And that's sort of the push and pull of Bamidbar, and that is exactly what Hoshea is all about. Right? That is the story of Hoshea. That is what happens, right? There's this severance for the first time in Jewish history. You lo ami, lo ruchama, you are not my nation, you are not an object of mercy, but then it's not really that bad, right? There will be a consolation. It is really bad, but it's not as total as that sounds, right? There is going to be that connection that everlasts, that even though just like Hoshea is still connected to his spouse, who is a prostitute and unfaithful, when she becomes faithful, that relationship is renewed and re-sanctified and transitioned from Baali to Ishi, right? It's all part of that same notion. That is a connection to Bamidbar. That's one connection. I think a thematic connection about Bamidbar as a whole, the portion of Bamidbar in particular, about this tension between the ideal, which doesn't seem to come to be, right? That's the first part. And by the way, as an aside, I just thought of this now because I've been thinking about this, right? We're about to celebrate Shavuot, right? We celebrate Shavuot. It's very odd that we celebrate Shavuot when we celebrate Shavuot, right? Number one, we don't really know when the Torah was given, right? In our tradition, right, Zman Matan Toratenu, it is the time we receive the Torah. It doesn't say that anywhere really in the verses, right? There's a whole debate in the rabbinic tradition. Is it the 6th day? Is it the 7th day? When exactly does all this happen? We're not really sure, right? But that's our tradition. But number two, what happens at that moment of receiving the Torah, this great idealized moment? What's happening? Tell me the scene. Moses on top of the mountain getting the 10 Commandments. Tell me what's happening in the camp. We are CNN standby reporter, right, in the camp. What's happening?
They're seeing thunder and, they're hearing. They're hearing.
Well, that's the 10 Commandments. But what's happening now the next day, right? Moses is up there getting the luchot. What are we celebrating?
They're building the egel.
They're really going calf. They're really going calf, right? We're celebrating a massive failure, right?
Yeah.
Part of the message of Bamidbar, maybe the message of Shavuot, or part of the message of Shavuot, and maybe connected is the message of Bamidbar, which is parenthetically always read the Shabbat before. We have to read Bamidbar before Shavuot. We can never, let's say there's a double parsha or something like that, we always make sure that Bamidbar is read before Shavuot. So why? Maybe it's part of the same message, that as much as we celebrate this great optimism, the ideal at that moment, we recognize that there are challenges. We recognize that there might be detours, very long detours, and that idealized state might not even be realistically possible. But we celebrate receiving the mission. We celebrate receiving the moment of trying to do that, even though we will fail initially, and know that we'll have another chance and another chance and another chance. Right? So that might be sort of the connection here between why we're reading this, particularly this week, 2 days before Shavuot. But that's an aside. So why are we reading this on Parshat Bamidbar? It is a recognition of the position in Bamidbar and the story as a whole, the story arc throughout the entire book, and that starts off in our Parsha. One other suggestion that's often given, the face value one, is the first verse. If you look at Vayam Misbar B'nei Yisrael K'chol Yam, and the people and the number of the people of Israel shall be like the sand of the sea. right, that won't be able to be counted, that won't be able to be numbered, right? Is that true, right? Don't we, what is Bamidbar all about? Lee, you're muted.
Yeah, it's this contrast. I mean, it's talking about here how they can't be counted, yet the parsha is about counting them.
Right. So half of like the beginning of the Bamidbar Rabbah deals with this connection, right? And so we get, and the Talmud deals with this, right? How can this be, right? How can this be? Is this really true, right? Right. The Bamidbar Rabbah, Bet, the second entry. These are the countings of the people of Israel, which is the beginning of Bamidbar. But doesn't it say in the book of Hosea, doesn't it say in the book of Hosea that this is that the number of the people of Israel will be like choyom, like the sands of grain, the grains of sand of the sea, right? They can't be counted. So now they give different answers. How can this be? So they give three different answers that I'll just suggest here. Number one is God and one is the people, right? Israel, the numbers, right? It's because God knows what it is, but it's not all the people, right? Not kan biyad adam, kan biyad shamayim, right? The people, it won't be, it's only God can do it, not the people, right? Another suggestion is no, when the people are righteous, they'll be innumerable. When the people are not righteous, they'll be numerable, right? They'll be a real number, somewhere between 0 and infinity, right? Tried to teach Amalia. She came home. I learned the biggest number is infinity. I tried to teach her, no, Amalia, infinity is not a number. She's very confused. She said, but Mora Shandel told me infinity is a number. Like, it's not a number. Anyways, you will understand, number theory, hopefully, before she's five. The other suggestion given is Kan Rashayim, Kan Sadiqim, that the evil doers of the people of Israel are countable, but Sadiqim, the righteous people, are not countable. So how do we make sense of this? Right, there are differing reasons what's going on. How do we make sense of this? And how do we understand this connection between these this Haftarah and our Parsha? So I think in general, the idea about counting, and this is probably more about Bamidbar than it is about anything else, right? What's the problem why we don't count Jews? In each of these situations, each of the stories we talk about, there's something that happens when you count people. The effect of counting, in many ways, limits them. It takes away, it robs them of their personality. It robs them of their individuality, right? We know one person who dies of COVID, right? That's a tragedy. We know 550,000 Americans who die of COVID. That's a statistic, right? It's just human nature. It's a statistic, right? That's human nature, right? We know, like when we talk about the Holocaust, right? 6 million is such a large number, it's impossible to fathom. We focus on individuals, right? In Yad Vashem, they have this book that says Jews 6 million times. It's like this thing, right? Which you can't really get a scale on camera, right? But it's very, very thick, right? What's the message there? What's going on there? The idea is trying to notice that. So what does that have to do with our conversation here? So the relationship between God and the Jewish people is innumerable, meaning it's unique, it's special, it's not just a statistic, it can't just be thrown away. But that is sort of the message here. What's interesting to note is all of these exceptions are all moments where we count Jews and simultaneously maintain their individuality or reinforce their uniqueness, right? Think about our Parsha. Why are we counting the people in Bamidbar?
For the Nachab, for the army.
The army, yeah.
For the what?
The army.
For the army.
Before the army, though, what do we give them? What are we telling them? We're telling them where they're camping. We're giving them Degalim. We're giving them flags, right? That's the unspoken theme of Bamidbar, right? Is the flags. The people each get their flags. Degel this, Degel that. They each get their flag. What's a flag? Right? Each of them get their flag. What's a flag? It's their own identity. right? Reuven's important. It has a role. It has a flag, a unique identity within the sum total of the entire Jewish people. Shimon, they have a flag. They have a different role. Levi, they have a flag. They have a different role. Even within the households, there are different family seals that get given that are described and each have different roles in them, right? The notion of the flags is that the unity of the Jewish people is manifest in the diversity of the tribes and the different traits that they bring, right? And this is the idea that Midrash tries to accentuate in lots of places, right? The Jewish people cross the Yam Suf, 12 different openings open, each for each tribe, right? So as the Jewish people are a whole, their wholeness is shown by diversity of their parts, right? And so when we count in our Parsha, we're actually reaffirming the uniqueness, the dignity of each individual tribe, right? That's why we're counting them, right? To show their each component parts. And then you think about the exceptions here, right? Who can count? Who can count? Who can't, right? We gave 3 exceptions. God can count, but people cannot. God can count, and people cannot, number 1. Number 2, the righteous versus the tzaddikim or the Rishayim, the evil, the wicked versus the evil. And number 3, when the people are righteous, when the people are not righteous as a whole, right? Three answers we give. Think about it this way. When God counts every individual, right, as a whole, God can both simultaneously count the wholeness of the Jewish people and understand the individual nature of each person, right? That is not beyond the power of an infinite God, right? People cannot. So the first answer to the Midrash is people can't count because we're not be able to count and hold the unity of every individual personality, but God can. When we talk about tzaddikim and rishayim, we distinguish between those that are righteous and those that aren't, right? When you're bringing evil into the world, we don't care what type of evil. You don't get a unique evil and you get a unique evil and you get a new, we just lump you together. But the righteousness, the power that one person has when they're righteous, and the different types of righteousness that can be described in the world, we have a staked interest in making sure that everyone recognizes their individual ones, right? Not lumping them all together and making them a statistic. And the same thing, of course, with the other part about whether we're righteous or not as a whole. Again, if we're just a bunch of people who aren't righteous, so we're a statistic, it doesn't matter. But if we can, if the people as a whole are making a profound impact as a righteous people on the world, so then each individual person who's doing that has a unique part in it, is important in that process. So another reason why this Haftarah is read is because of this contrast, and perhaps to echo the question about how we count, when we count, what does counting Jews signify, and what notion or message we're trying to bring. So over here, we're bringing about this Haftarah, where we talk about the count being impossible in context with Haftarah, this Midrash. It's very possible the person who chose this Midrash, who chose this Haftarah for Bamidbar, is familiar with the teachings in the Midrash that bring in conversation our parak and our parsha. And so they chose over here as sort of like a latent commentary on that Midrash to highlight these notions. That's reason 1. And then reason 2, this more holistic notion about thinking about Bamidbar as a progression as things fall apart, this severance, but still opportunity to come back, which is very much mimicked by Hosea, and actually is the first time that severance is brought to the people in Hosea. We talked about a lot today, these 2 reasons why we read this Haftarah. We give a lot of background about Hoshea, about what he's doing as a person, what his story is in particular here, why it's a bad speech for a bar mitzvah boy to give at his bar mitzvah, and a little bit this notion of the desert, which is clearly a center character in Bamidbar, the book in the desert, about how the desert both represents a point of redemption, of repentance, and of wiping away all bad habits, sort of stripping back the basis of human nature that is then the foundation to reignite the relationship and transition from Ba'ali to Ishi, from a relationship of transaction to relational, based on Tzedek and Mishpat, Chesed and Rachamim, and Emunah, and knowledge of God, whatever that means. All right, thank you for joining us.
Very nice. Thank you.
Thank you.
2 quick announcements. One is tonight for women at 8:30, it's Torah in the Flash. Hope to see you there. It's going to be awesome. I will not see you there actually, but it will be awesome. Number 2, Shavuot schedule is out. We're really looking forward to doing things a little bit different this year. but still, in the spirit of what we try to do every Shavuot, celebrate by learning. And we hope you'll join us for all of that. The schedule is out. If you have any questions about the schedule, let us know, let me know, and we'll see you soon. Yeah.
You're going to send out a schedule